The silence before. The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesdays meant anything to the Crevathi Concordat, or the Salith Empire, or any of the 47 species that had signed the Treaty of Broken Stars 3 centuries ago. But to humanity, it was a Tuesday, mid-morning in Geneva, late evening in Tokyo, the kind of unremarkable rotation of a pale blue world that had seen 10,000 Tuesdays before. The message was simple. Clinical. Delivered through the standard diplomatic channels that humanity had painstakingly built over 200 years of cautious expansion into a galaxy that tolerated them the way an ocean tolerates driftwood. Notice of territorial adjustment. Human colony Kepler 442, designation Haven's Reach, has been reclassified as contested space. Evacuation protocol suspended. Tribunal pending. No explanation. No justification. Just words that erased 12,000 lives from the ledger of protected space. In the marble halls of the United Earth Council, Ambassador Chin Yuki read the message 3 times. Her hands didn't shake. Years of diplomatic training had taught her that much, but her throat tightened until swallowing felt like choking. They took Haven's Reach, she said quietly. Around the circular table, representatives from every nation that had once warred over borders and resources now sat united under a single flag. The flag of a species that had learned too late and at terrible cost, that division was a luxury only the powerful could afford. Took? General Okoro's voice was granite. They can't take a colony. The treaty? The treaty is void if they declare contested space first. Ambassador Teresh, the VRNN observer, spoke without looking up from his datapad. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture humans had learned meant discomfort. It's an old loophole. Rarely invoked. The Concordat hasn't used it in 800 years. Why now? Chen's question hung in the recycled air. Teresh finally looked up. His chitinous face was unreadable, but his voice carried something humans had learned to recognize across species. Pity. Because they can. Because you are tolerated, Ambassador Chin. Not respected. When the strong wish to test limits, they test them against the weak. The silence that followed was the kind that vibrated. That pressed against eardrums and made hearts beat in the hollow spaces between words. Chin stood slowly. She was small, barely 5 feet in her formal shoes, but she'd negotiated trade agreements with species that could crush her skull with one hand. She'd smiled through insults delivered in 50 languages. She'd swallowed rage so many times it had become a familiar burn in her chest. How many? She asked. Pardon? How many ships did they send to enforce this reclassification? Teresh consulted his datapad. 3 Concordat cruisers. A Salith carrier group. Approximately 40 vessels total. They established a blockade 4 hours ago. Your colonists attempted to transmit distress signals. Communications were jammed. 2 civilian transports were disabled attempting to breach the perimeter. Casualties? Unconfirmed. Likely minimal. The Concordat prefers leverage over corpses. Chin felt something shift in her chest. A gear catching. A mechanism engaging that had been oiled and maintained for 200 years of careful diplomacy and strategic surrender. Minimal, she repeated softly. 12,000 light-years away, on a world where grass grew purple and the sky burned orange at dawn, Sarah Vance held her daughter's hand and watched the ships descend. They came through the clouds like falling stars, except stars didn't cast shadows that swallowed entire valleys. Stars didn't hum with the kind of bass-frequency power that made your teeth ache and your bones remember they were just calcium and fear. Mommy? Emma was 7. Old enough to understand that something was wrong. Young enough to believe her mother could fix it. It's okay, baby. Sarah squeezed the small hand in hers. Around them, the town square was filling with people. Farmers and engineers and teachers and all the ordinary humans who'd traveled 40 years in cryosleep to plant crops on alien soil and name their streets after Earth cities they'd never see again. Someone had started singing. An old song, Sarah couldn't remember the name, about going home. Others joined in, their voices thin against the descending roar of warships that could level mountains. The blockade had been sudden. One moment, Haven's Reach was just another colony on the edge of explored space, trading hydroponics data with neighboring systems and streaming entertainment from Earth with only a 40-year delay. The next, the sky was full of vessels bearing sigils that Sarah recognized from educational broadcasts. The Crevathi Claw. The Salith Spiral. Empires. Ancient and vast and utterly uninterested in explanations. The ships didn't land. They hovered, 50 meters up, 100 varying heights that suggested calculation rather than caution. Gravity wells formed beneath them, pulling at loose objects and making the air taste like ozone and copper. Then the broadcast began. Every screen in every home, every data pad, every communications relay simultaneously displayed the same image. A Crevathi commander, his 4 arms folded in a gesture humans had learned meant finality. Humans of Haven's Reach, the translation came through clear and cold. Your world has been designated as strategic territory under Concordat authority. You will comply with relocation protocols. Resistance is inadvisable. You have 6 solar rotations to prepare for transfer. The image cut. The screens went dark. Around Sarah, people began to shout. Questions, demands, prayers in languages from every corner of Earth. But beneath the noise, beneath the fear that tasted like metal and adrenaline, Sarah felt something else. She looked down at Emma, whose small face was set in an expression Sarah recognized. It was the same expression Emma wore when she lost at chess, or when math problems didn't make sense, or when bigger kids said mean things at school. It was the look of someone taking notes. Someone learning. We're going to be okay, Sarah said, and she wasn't sure if she was lying. Back on Earth, in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps that had once been built to survive nuclear war, the United Earth Council convened in emergency session. They came in person. All of them. No holograms, no remote attendance. When your species faces a threshold, you cross it together. Chin had stopped counting the hours. Stopped eating. The coffee was cold in her cup, but she drank it anyway because consciousness was the only weapon she had left. Options, Secretary General Morrison said. He was old, 90 years in a body maintained by medicine that would have seemed like magic to his great-grandparents. His voice carried the weight of a species that had clawed its way from caves to stars and knew, intimately, how far there was to fall. Military response. General Okoro pulled up tactical displays. Red markers bloomed across the holographic star map like a disease. We have 18 ships in range. Destroyers mostly. 3 carriers. Against 40 Concordat vessels. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Diplomatic appeal. Ambassador Patel's fingers moved through treaty documents, centuries of carefully negotiated words that suddenly felt as substantial as smoke. The VRYN might support us. The Tessari have historical grievances with the Crevathi. If we can build a coalition. That takes months. Chen's voice cut through the planning like a scalpel. We have 6 days. The room fell silent. So we negotiate, Morrison said finally. We give them what they want. Trade concessions, territory, resources. They don't want concessions. Chen stood slowly. Around her neck hung a pendant, a gift from her daughter before she left for the diplomatic corps. A small silver earth, continents etched in blue. They want to know if we'll fight back. They're testing us like Teresh said. Every species in the galaxy is watching to see what happens when you push humanity. Then what do you propose? Chen looked at the star map. At the tiny blue marker that represented Haven's Reach. At the 12,000 souls who trusted humanity to protect them. We respond, she said quietly. But not the way they expect. The communications blackout lasted 36 hours. To the galaxy, to the watching species with their ancient empires and territorial disputes measured in parsecs, it looked like silence. Like acceptance. Like a weak species doing what weak species always do when the strong come calling. But inside human space, behind the veil of encrypted networks and quantum-locked channels, something else was happening. Scientists received priority alerts. Not requests, alerts. The kind that pulled you out of bed at 3 a.m. and made your security clearance suddenly matter. Engineers found themselves rerouted to classified facilities. Assembly lines retooled overnight. Civilian factories started producing components that didn't match any civilian specifications. Soldiers who'd spent careers in peacetime suddenly found their training wasn't theoretical anymore. And in 1,000 cities across Earth and Mars and the orbital habitats humanity had built with sweat and mathematics, people began to understand. They were at war. Not the kind of war with declarations and battlefield glory. Not the clean war of strategy games and historical simulations. The other kind. The desperate kind. The kind where you fight because the alternative is erasing every choice you've ever made. In Geneva, Ambassador Chin stood before the council one more time. We send one message, she said. To every species in the Concordat. Every empire that signed the treaty. Every civilization that's ever traded with us or studied us or tolerated our presence. What message? Chin smiled. It was not a happy expression. We tell them the truth. The broadcast went out on every frequency. Every channel. Every diplomatic wavelength that connected the vast and ancient civilizations of a galaxy humanity had only just begun to explore. Ambassador Chin appeared on screens from the core worlds to the rim. No fancy graphics. No dramatic music. Just a human woman in a simple suit, speaking in a voice that carried 200 years of careful restraint finally released. To the civilizations of the galactic community, she began. Humanity has received your message. We understand your position. You have superior numbers, superior technology, superior firepower. You believe this gives you the authority to take what is ours. She paused. Let the translation algorithms catch up. Let 47 species hear the words in their own languages. You are correct about your advantages. We do not dispute them. But you have made one critical error in your assessment of humanity. Another pause. Longer this time. You believe we survive because you allow it. You believe we are weak because we choose diplomacy over destruction. You believe that patience is the same as fear. Chin leaned forward slightly. Her eyes found the camera, and through it found the eyes of every being watching. Humanity does not seek this conflict. We do not want war. But we are not asking for your permission to exist. We are informing you of our decision to continue existing. What happens next depends entirely on whether you respect that decision. She straightened. You have 6 days. We suggest you use them wisely. The broadcast ended. Across the galaxy, in council chambers and war rooms and throne rooms built before Earth learned to forge iron, the reaction was uniform. Laughter. The humans had threatened them. The small, soft, emotional species that still measured their stellar presence in centuries rather than epochs had drawn a line in vacuum and dared empires to cross it. The Crevathi commander who delivered the ultimatum to Haven's Reach watched the broadcast twice. Then he gave an order that seemed to him both obvious and merciful. Prepare to occupy the planet. Show minimal force. These creatures do not understand power. We will teach them gently. His officers obeyed, because they had trained for 800 years in the art of conquest and integration. They knew how weak species behaved when pressed. They knew the patterns of surrender. What they didn't know, what no one in the galaxy knew because humanity had never been tested like this before, was what happened when patience wasn't fear. When silence wasn't submission. When the weak looked at the strong and said, quietly and without anger, not this time. The calculus of desperation. The Crevathi didn't understand mathematics the way humans did. They understood computation. Elegant, precise, the kind of logic that governs star charts and gravitational fields and the perfect angles at which ships should enter atmosphere. But mathematics as language, as philosophy, as the desperate art of finding patterns in chaos? That was something else entirely. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood in a laboratory that hadn't existed 3 days ago. Around her, 200 scientists from 40 nations worked in shifts that had stopped resembling human sleep cycles. Coffee stations stood next to emergency showers. Cots lined walls covered in holographic projections of equations that writhed and shifted like living things. Show me again, she said. The image resolved. A Crevathi cruiser, its hull covered in the kind of adaptive shielding that had made the Concordat unbeatable for 8 centuries. Energy weapons splashed against it like water on glass. Kinetic rounds dissolved into quantum foam before impact. Even nuclear detonations just dissipated, swallowed by fields that bent space itself. Impenetrable, said Dr. Yuki Tanaka, his eyes red from 70 hours without sleep. Theoretically. The energy requirements alone. Show me the flaw. There isn't. Show me the flaw. Amara's voice carried the kind of exhaustion that wrapped around and became clarity. Everything has one. Physics doesn't care about empires. Find it. Yuki pulled up the simulation again. Frame by frame. Quantum scanner data from every encounter humanity had ever recorded with Concordat vessels. Decades of diplomatic meetings where humans had smiled and traded and carefully, meticulously, measured everything. Because that's what humans did. Even when they were weak, especially when they were weak, they took notes. There. Yuki froze the frame. Zoomed in on a section of shielding near the aft engine housing. When they transition to FTL, there's a moment, 0.03 seconds, where the forward shields have to collapse to redirect power. It's necessary. You can't maintain defensive fields and tear a hole in spacetime simultaneously. 0.03 seconds. Yes. How do we hit something in 0.03 seconds when our fastest weapons have a cycle time of 1.2 seconds? Yuki smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged on someone who just solved an impossible equation or lost their mind entirely. We don't. We make them hit themselves. 12,000 light-years away on Haven's Reach, Sarah Vance had stopped sleeping. The blockade had tightened. The Concordat ships now orbited at lower altitude, close enough that their shadows passed over the colony like clouds made of metal and threat. Drones swept the streets, counting, cataloging, reducing human lives to data points in someone else's inventory. But the Crevathi hadn't landed troops, hadn't seized buildings, hadn't done anything except hover and watch and wait for the fear to do their work for them. They didn't understand that fear and preparation could coexist. In basements and maintenance tunnels, in the service corridors of the hydroponics domes and the abandoned mining facilities on the colony's edge, humans worked. "Is this treason?" someone asked. A young man, couldn't have been more than 20, holding a piece of mining equipment that Sarah's team had quietly modified over the past 4 days. Treason against whom? Sarah kept her voice steady. Around her, 40 colonists listened. Farmers and teachers and the kind of ordinary people who'd come to the stars because Earth was crowded and the frontier promised room to breathe. "We haven't surrendered. We haven't been conquered. Right now we're just preparing for multiple scenarios. They'll kill us if we resist. Maybe." Sarah looked at the modified laser cutter in the young man's hands. At the improvised communications jammer 2 engineers had built from weather satellite parts. At the faces around her, scared, yes, but set with the kind of determination that didn't come from courage. It came from something older, the refusal to be erased without leaving a mark. But here's what I know about bullies. I've watched Emma deal with them since kindergarten. If you give them everything immediately, they take it and ask for more. But if you make it complicated, if you make it cost something. She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Emma sat in the corner, her data pad open, sketching something that looked like tactical diagrams. 7 years old and already thinking in terms of lines of sight and choke points. Sarah wondered if this was childhood anymore. Wondered if there was a line between protecting your daughter and teaching her to fight, and which side of that line she'd crossed. Then she looked at the ships overhead and stopped wondering. On Earth, the military mobilization was the quiet kind. No parades. No martial music. No speeches about glory and honor, because humanity had learned those lessons the hard way, written in the ashes of cities that had believed war was noble. In the orbital shipyards above Singapore, the ECS Determination, a destroyer that had spent 15 years on peaceful escort duty, underwent modifications that would have voided its warranty if warranties meant anything anymore. Commander James Park stood on the bridge and watched welding sparks cascade in the viewports like reverse stars. "Report," he said. His XO, Lieutenant Sarah Kamathi, pulled up the specifications. Retrofit complete in 18 hours. Weapon systems upgraded, if you can call stripping half our missile tubes an upgrade. What are we carrying instead? Honestly, Commander? I'm not sure. The specs are classified above my clearance. Engineering says there's some kind of autonomous packages. Deployment system only. No detonation mechanism. Park frowned. 20 years in the Navy and he'd learned to read between lines. We're not being armed for combat. No, sir. Then what are we being armed for? Kamathi met his eyes. Creative problem solving. The VRNN observer, Teresh, requested a private meeting with Ambassador Chin on the 4th day. They met in a garden, one of the biodomes deep in the Geneva complex where Earth plants grew under artificial sunlight and the air tasted like chlorophyll and desperation. "Your species is making a mistake," Teresh said without preamble. His 4 eyes blinked in careful sequence. "I have observed the mobilization, the industrial retooling, the troop movements you believe are concealed. We're not hiding anything." Chin touched a tomato plant, felt the leaves between her fingers. Her grandmother had grown tomatoes. Before the diaspora. Before humans scattered across the stars because one planet was no longer enough. What's the point of hiding preparation when demonstration is the goal? Demonstration of what? Futility? Teresh's mandibles clicked, a gesture of agitation. You cannot win. Even if, impossibly, you destroy the blockade at Haven's Reach, the Concordat will respond with force that will turn your colony into glass. Then your homeworld. Then every human settlement from here to the rim. This is how power maintains itself. Is that how the VRNN maintain power? My species learned submission long ago. We survived. Submission isn't survival. Chin turned to face him fully. It's just slow extinction with paperwork. Your metaphors won't stop a Concordat war fleet. No, Chin agreed. But here's the thing about humanity, Teresh. We're very good at math. And the math says if we submit now, we'll submit again. And again. Until one day someone decides humans aren't even worth subjugating. We become a footnote. A caution sign. Here's what happens when you're too weak to matter. You prefer glorious extinction? We prefer complicated extinction. Chin smiled thinly. You know what costs more than conquering a weak species? Conquering a weak species that makes you pay for every meter. That turns every victory into a question. Was this worth it? We don't need to win, Teresh. We just need to make losing expensive enough that empires choose easier targets. Teresh was quiet for a long moment. Around them, plants grew in soil shipped from a world that would never feel alien wind again if humanity miscalculated. There is a word in Crevathi, he said finally. No direct translation. Closest approximation, the species that bites while dying. It is not a compliment. We'll take it anyway. In the laboratory, Amara had stopped sleeping entirely. Sleep was for people with time. We have a solution, she announced to a room full of scientists who looked like they'd been living in a wind tunnel. Probably. Maybe. It violates 3 laws of physics and requires timing so precise that quantum uncertainty becomes a legitimate concern, but... General Okoro had come down personally. His uniform was crisp even at 3 a.m., which Sarah found simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. But if we synchronize it correctly, we can use their own shields against them. Amara brought up the simulation. The Concordat ships use quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication between vessels. That's how they coordinate so perfectly. But entanglement is sensitive. If we introduce a properly tuned resonance wave at the moment their shields cycle. She ran the simulation. The holographic Concordat fleet flickered. Then, cascading from ship to ship like dominoes made of light, the shields collapsed. Just for a moment. Just for 0.03 seconds. Long enough. What do we hit them with in 0.03 seconds? Okoro asked. We don't hit them with anything. Yuki stepped forward. We hit them with themselves. Their own weapons, their own momentum, their own power grids. We turn their strength into chaos. 40 ships trying to coordinate in perfect synchronization, suddenly blind and deaf to each other. They collide, Okoro finished softly. Some of them. Others just become vulnerable. Exactly as vulnerable as they need to be. Can you build it? Amara looked around the room. At scientists who'd come from universities and corporations and government labs. Who'd put aside grudges and patents and Nobel Prize ambitions to solve a single problem. How do you fight an empire when you're not strong enough? Already building it, General. The real question is, do we have a ship that can deliver it? Okoro smiled. It was not a kind expression. Commander Park's been asking what his new cargo is. I think it's time we told him. On Haven's Reach, the deadline approached. The Crevathi commander issued his final warning with the casual certainty of someone who'd overseen 100 integrations. The translation echoed through every speaker in the colony. Humans of Haven's Reach. Your 6 rotations have expired. Prepare for relocation processing. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. You have 1 solar rotation to comply. We will begin descent at dawn. In the town square, 12,000 humans stood in silence. Some held hands. Some prayed. Some simply stood because standing was all they had left. Sarah held Emma close and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to the deep black where alien ships hung like stars that had forgotten how to shine. Mommy? Emma's voice was small. Are we going to die? Sarah thought about lying. About comfort. About all the things parents tell children to help them sleep when the world is ending. Then she thought about the modified mining equipment hidden in basement workshops. About the communication network they'd built in the dead zones the Concordat sensors couldn't reach. About 12,000 ordinary humans who'd spent 6 days becoming something else. I don't know, baby, she said honestly. But if we do, we're going to make sure they remember us. Emma nodded solemnly. Then she pulled out her data pad and added a note to her tactical sketches. 7 years old and already thinking like humanity always did when backed into corners. How do we make this cost them? Back on Earth, in the war room deep beneath Geneva, the final pieces moved into position. Commander Park's determination was en route, carrying a weapon that wasn't a weapon. 17 other ships followed in careful formation, each carrying pieces of a plan that only made sense when you understood that winning wasn't the objective. Surviving was the objective. Making them remember was the objective. Ambassador Chin stood before the holographic display showing Haven's Reach and the 40 Concordat vessels in perfect siege formation around it. They think we'll surrender, she said quietly. Will we? Secretary General Morrison asked. We'll respond. Chin touched the display, her fingers passing through light made solid. And they'll learn what every bully eventually learns. What's that? Chin looked at him. At the assembled leaders of a species that had clawed its way from caves to stars, that had split atoms and mapped genomes and touched other worlds with machines before daring to go themselves. That the quiet ones are quiet because they're thinking. She turned back to the display. Send the order. All ships, execute protocol determination. Across human space, from Earth to Mars to the scattered colonies that had trusted humanity to protect them, the response began. Not with weapons. Not with threats. With mathematics. With the kind of desperate, beautiful problem-solving that happens when a species decides that extinction is negotiable but surrender is not. The Concordat expected fear. They expected bargaining. They expected what weak species always did when the strong came calling.